Hey guys, so as usual I wanted to bring a tier list of rogue decks using Dueling Book data from Scope, and you can check my older videos to check out how the tier score is calculated. And before I continue, a big thanks to my sponsors as always, links and discount codes in the description below. Now this was my overall meta tier list by the data that I shared last week for this month, and so for this video we'll be covering decks that are not seen here in tier 1 and 2, with the exception that I will still be including Dark World and Heroes as rogue. I mentioned in my last video that Dark World seemed to have ranked really high because the structure deck just came out and a lot of players were probably trying it out, but I definitely do not think it deserves to be in the tier 2 spot at the moment. There's of course many decks that Scope unfortunately cannot identify at the moment, and some of the notable ones include Naturia, Exosister, Kashtira, Crystal Beast, Labyrinth, and Dinomorphia. This is unfortunate because these decks are actually pretty solid rogue contenders, as most of them are built to be tier elements, so they will not be part of this video sadly, but hopefully Scope can update someday to be able to identify them. So now let's get right into the tier list, and starting off with the highest score is Dark World, which at the moment still has a ton of players trying it out right now. Win percentage wise, not doing so well at 44% in the last 7 days. Definitely got released at a bad time considering that tier elements are tier 0 with effects that would trigger if they're sent to the grave. Not to mention this deck is as die roll dependent as it gets. Still a really cool gimmick though, and maybe once tier elements have been powered down through another ban list, this deck can become a bit more relevant. Next we have Heroes, which as I repeatedly say has a really strong chance to win against tier elements if it gets to go first. Dark Law on its own is MVP, but when you pair that with a one-sided skill drain like Plasma, or a recurring pop like DP, or even Sunrise, it's pretty tough to get through as a tier player. Sadly, its win percentage at 48% is not amazing, but if you are looking for a rogue option, Hero honestly is pretty decent. Then we have Sky Striker, which I think ranks this high on the rogue tier list because it's always been a fan favorite popular deck. The deck is honestly in a really bad spot right now because the Bestial to banish Ray is huge, not to mention the Grave Shufflers will return whatever Kagari targets. To add insult to injury, they even lost Mystic Mind now, so as a going second deck, this deck is probably going to struggle a lot, as demonstrated by its 40% win percentage, but Konami seems to really like creating Sky Striker support, although admittedly, most of the time it's been pretty bad, but maybe it will come back to relevance again. Rounding up the A tier is a deck defined as Red Eyes, which I assume is Dragoon Turbo. I'm seeing this more and more now on Dueling Book data, so I am pretty curious. I guess Dragoon can be pretty strong against tier elements perhaps, and when combined with Floodgates it can be pretty difficult to get through this deck, especially in a game 1 situation. Since one of the older Dragoon Turbo decks used to be Necro Valley Stun, that would fit actually really well with this current format right now. Moving on to the next section, we have Mathmech. It surprisingly had a pretty good match win percentage in the last 7 days at 57%. Looks like it's somehow hanging on despite the play of Bestials and Keldor Medora that are pretty detrimental to this deck's strategy. I know there's a lot of diehard Mathmech fans out there, so hopefully you guys are somehow making this deck work. Next is a similar deck in Ad Ignister, which continues to have its high win percentage at 58% as it seems to do every month. I would assume the Grave Shufflers will also hinder this strategy as well, but once you make a Rival Ignister, I suppose it can be pretty hard to out for most decks, except for Sprite of course, since they have easy access to Pixies. Then we have Dinos, which as I always say, unfortunately the numbers get merged with Dinomorphia decks on Scope. Had a solid 50% win percentage, which is good for a rogue deck, and this is a deck that can go second or first depending on the variant, so there's some flexibility. Next we have Madolche, which I actually think definitely belongs in the highest category of rogue, if not maybe even borderline tier 2, as Madolche Vermisolf is very strong against tier elements and their turn 1 board can be pretty nasty. A deck that can set up some shufflers and a negate with the potential OTK once their turn rolls back around, definitely a rogue deck worth exploring if you're interested. And then we have the good old Salamangreat, which unfortunately is not doing so well in this format, considering that the Grave Shufflers definitely hurt this deck a lot, although it's at least immune to Bestials. They are a cyberspace deck, so they can at least play Rivalry to combat tier elements, but if they go second, it's not that winnable. I will actually be posting a Salamangreat deck profile in the next day or two, so stay tuned for that. Next we have Virtual World, a deck that is now almost quickly forgotten even as a rogue strategy. Shen Shen as a walking macrocosmos is honestly kinda nice, and they are not really affected by Bestials either. Unfortunately, even when this deck was tier 1, it always had some breaking issues, and I think there are better rogue options out there where you want to be as consistent as possible if you have the opportunity to go first in this meta, since you just cannot afford to waste that chance. At tier C, we are starting with Altergeist, which while it did make that brief meta appearance earlier this summer at I believe yours or one of the YCS events, has not done much since. As a trap deck, I think the better option is probably Labyrinth, which as I mentioned earlier in the video, sadly cannot be identified by Scope. But I know there's a lot of loyal Altergeist players out there, and I know I've personally seen some lists play Shifter in the deck just because of tier limits, so maybe there are some workarounds in this format. Then we have a deck that we have not seen in these rogue analysis in a while, and that is Mathmech, which actually had a really strong 63% match win percentage, although based on a small sample size. Now, around 2020 and early 2021, Mathmech used to be highlighted as one of the best rogue decks in my analysis that I always did, but phased out since then, so it's really good to see it coming back. Usually this is a going second deck that will incorporate invoke stuff as well, and has a surprisingly good grind game with their back row negating cards in the same column as their Mathmech monster. Next we have Thunder Dragon, which did briefly have some meta potential after the release of Bestials, as it did top at least one premier event. The 50% match win percentage is solid, and while it no longer has Colossus, at least if you are a diehard Thunder Dragon fan, the deck is still playable in the current meta, although I believe it probably plays more so like Dragon Link deck at this moment. Then we have a pure punk deck still surviving somehow despite the ban of Chaos Ruler putting an end to these cards as an engine at least. Their field spell to draw multiple times in the same turn is actually pretty nice, and if you're a fan of synchro strategies, this might be worth exploring if you're not really wanting to play Sword Soul. Next we have Madolche, which is a bit weird to see this in the rogue category again after its repeated meta relevance since its release. The deck still seems new to me for some reason, even though it's actually been out for over 2.5 years. Bestials banishing your 2 copies of Golden Lord that you typically play basically just ends your game plan, and the Grave Shufflers will also prevent you from probably ever summoning this guy out at 3500 attack. Crazy to see that even as a rogue option, Madolche has become basically unplayable right now unless maybe you mix it with other strategies. And then we have Cyber Dragons, which as some of you watching this video will know is my personal favorite deck. You can check out my recent deck profile where I explain my thoughts on how this deck can work in the current format, where you can blind second for game 1 as you normally do, but shift to a going first build post side. Although always has a terrible win percentage online and definitely not nearly as playable as it once was. And then we have the return of Earth Machines in the Rogue tier list, which again also suffers from the Grave Shufflers. Some of their monsters just happen to be dark despite being called Earth Machines, so that can be hindered by Bestials as well. On top of that, they were always a deck that can play Skill Drain, but Skill Drain is not so hot right now either, so it's not the best time for this deck, although it's fun to play. Next we have Black Wings, which is pretty cool to see. The new Assault Dragon basically makes it so that you take burn damage with effects that you activate, and if they manage to get 2 out on the field, then it can actually be pretty hard to conduct your tier plays since the deck does need to activate a lot of monster effects to continue. Really cool to see this old strategy be played even now, although doing absolutely terrible of course with the 42% match win percentage. Lastly, we have Trickstar, which is pretty cool, although not doing so hot either at 40%. I know one of the older Trickstar builds that have been played a lot in the past involved Grand Maju, so perhaps they can play Shifter then, which at least gives them even a tiny bit of fighting chance against tier limits. The Droll Reincarnation lock has always been nasty to rip off every card of your opponent's hand, but probably not the best rogue option to explore right now. And finally, we end the tier list with DDD, which certainly has fallen off even as a rogue option, let alone its brief stint as a potential tier 2 strategy. If you still play DDD, let me know how this deck fares against tier limits. I can only imagine even if it can hold its own against tiers, all the other decks running Deep Shifter to counter them would probably hurt this deck as well, since it is a pendulum deck, unless I'm totally wrong there. Alright guys, so that was it for this month's Rogue tier list. Hope that was interesting. I know it's a bad time to play Rogue right now, and realistically most strategies are not very viable in the current meta, but if you're a diehard Rogue fan, then I am certainly rooting for you as you continue to pilot it and just wait out for a new format. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bold Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrel Lord, Spooky Boogie, Steven Phillips, and Chaz Blanks, as always for supporting the channel. You guys really mean a lot to me. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, link down below. Take care guys.